Hello and good evening all on this Fridayest of Wednesdays. As promised in last week's video and in what I'm intending as something of a recurring video series for any historic events that I attend in future, let's take a quick look through the entry lists for this year's Historic Sports Car Racing Classic 24 Hours at Daytona. We'll look at both the Classic 24-hour entrants as well as the sprint groups, as those two usually encompass pretty much all announced attendees. Although I happen to know of a few entrants who showed up on this list early and then quietly disappeared within hours or a day or two. If last year's Sebring entry list and attendees are anything to go by, they're quite possibly still planning to show up, but have chosen to disguise themselves for the purposes of anonymity or to preserve the element of surprise? I'll mention a few of my remaining suspicions at the end of the video, although most of them have actually come to pass as true. Also, in moving to establish a theme with this particular video series, it will be a bit more freewheeling and rambly than my regular content, as it's pretty much just bullet points, so thanks for humoring me, as ever. All photos that are faded in for additional context or a better look at a given car are, of course, my own, and if you see a photo you like, I am more than happy to sell prints for a nominal fee. You can find out more by commenting or by going back and watching the Chevy Decon Monza video or a couple of others where I do provide details. Alternately, if you're a driver or entrant, see a photo of your car that you like and would like a copy of said photo, please drop a comment and I'll be happy to hand deliver one to you at no charge at this or the next HSR event where we will both be, as a way of appreciating how much you guys do to make for fun and exciting events and for providing such excellent photographic material. For those of you who are unaware, Historic Sports Car Racing, now owned by IMSA, organizes a number of historic racing events around the United States throughout the year. This includes its original event, the Mitty at Road Atlanta, the Classic 24 Hours at Daytona, the Classic 6 Hours of the Glen at, you guessed it, Watkins Glen, 2 race weekends at Sebring, and a handful of others. Next year, they're actually undertaking a rather comprehensive rework of their schedule to more closely align with IMSA's and, I guess by reflex, NASCAR's priorities, but we'll leave that to one side for now. The Classic 24 Hours of Daytona is one of their big 3 races at current, both in terms of spectators and track time offered, and last year we actually got a live stream for the full event with commentary of, well, most of the daylight hours and some of the evening. At time of bullet point creation, I didn't have any word on whether or not that commentary and live stream would be returning this year, but I am given to understand from a third-party source that it is intended to have the live stream and at least some commentary. Yet again, it should be available on HSR's YouTube channel starting on Saturday. Incidentally, when I say big in terms of spectators, we're still talking about a few thousand people at most. It's hardly a capacity crowd, but it's still a damn sight more than you get at Sebring a month later. Daytona also affords some interesting and unique photo opportunities that, to my knowledge, aren't really available at any other major track that hosts vintage racing in the U.S., unless Indianapolis Motor Speedway hosts some sort of event of which I'm unaware, which is possible because I'm half a country away and only have so much time on my hands. But be that as it may, if you, dear viewers, would like a series of videos about the best photography spots at a given track, do let me know in the comments, and I'll start working on something for those tracks that I've had the pleasure to visit. Probably won't have time for anywhere new next year, but 2026, I'd like to make an attempt to either get up to Watkins Glen or VIR, maybe Laguna Seca for the Monterey Motorsports Reunion, or whatever they're calling it this week, and possibly Goodwood. But again, all of that is TBD based on many other things. HSR makes the entry lists available for all the races that are occurring that weekend, starting a few weeks before the event, with rolling updates as entries come in and receive approval, which, at least for me, makes for a dully entertaining morning read to see who's come in with the proverbial post. Okay, let's get started. We'll start, as with last year, in the sprint races, as this portion of the event has the largest number of entrants, and with competitors arriving on Tuesday, which is to say, actually right about as I'm recording this, I think we can safely say we're unlikely to see too many more folks coming out of the woodwork beyond the 163 entrants that we can see here. Again, we're starting with Group 2. It may have started out as Group 1, but they had to increase it to 2 because of inflation or something. Whatever numeric assignment they have, each group is comprised of vehicles of largely comparable performance capabilities and subdivided into several classes to provide some level of competitive balance. In most instances, we also have multiple groups on track at once, both to flesh out the fields and to make sure that everyone gets their fill of track time. As we can see, Group 2 is a bit less robustly populated than last year's Sebring shebang, with only a Ginetta, Morgan, and a single late-arriving Austin Mini Cooper S holding up the truly British side of things, which, of course, leaves us bereft of the Lolas, MGs, Lotuses, MGs, or that Elva Courier that we saw last year. We do have 2 other Minis, but they are models from after BMW's acquisition of the brand, and thus don't count towards true Britishness. Mr. Bill Treffert's C1 Corvette is back to delight our eardrums with its throaty roar yet again. There is an Alpha Spider, which wouldn't really be my first choice for the high banks of Daytona, but at the same time, beggars can't be choosers, and I wouldn't say no either. And then sitting squarely in the same class as the post-BMW Minis is that same Honda Prelude from last year. Looking at the pictures, and I suspect SSD does not stand for Super Star Destroyer, but rather stands for something like, Street Stock D. I have no idea what D stands for, although we do have SSC, B, and A, so possibly it's just like grading eggs or milk or something, where grade A is the fastest of the street stock cars. Unfortunately, the official schedule only contains explanations of the classic 24 groups and classes, so we're SOL on the SSDs unless someone gets me some more additional acronyms ASAP. But nevertheless, Group 2 is referred to as vintage sports cars. Moving on down, we have Group 3, vintage historic / production, etc. period, exact words, or as I prefer to call it, the first of our Porsche 911 classes. This year we do have our returning healthy crop of alternate format Porsches, as we will call them, a mix of the transaxle Porsches, mostly 944s, mostly turbos, and a few 914-6s, which still need their own video. There are also 2 early Boxsters, which is fun, and I think in many ways you could consider the 914's successor. But there are also 2 Ford Escort Mark 1s, neither of which I remember seeing last year, so that is a nice addition. There's another Morgan that is from 1953 +4, and all the way from Bracknell in the UK. We have just a single BMW 2002 from Mr. Dean DeSantis from Fort Lauderdale. And the chaps over at the Old Salty Dog appear to have either upgraded or expanded from their typical Lotus fare to a Fox Body Mustang. Well, I say upgraded, it's more of a lateral move, I'd argue. It's almost certainly better suited for Daytona from a performance perspective, but, and I may ruffle some feathers here, it's something of a massive downgrade on the look side of things, in my opinion. For those of you who remember from last year or any other event that you've been to at HSR, that these folks have been there, they typically run Lotus Elans that look really quite lovely. We've also got 2 old Toyota WSR prototypes from the early 90s, which will definitely get a video once I've got some better photos of them, like this weekend. The last time I remember seeing them was at the 2020 Sebring Historics, and I had no idea what they were at the time. I still don't know much about them, but they look kind of interesting. And again, we have a Diazio D962 to keep up the side for kit cars and for Oddity Week. If the livery is consistent with that of the photo, Mr. Slowmain has this year, and slightly amusingly, borrowed the paint job from Mazda's prototypes, despite this car nominally being styled off of a Porsche. But if memory serves, Mazda power plants were an option, so in that vein it does make sense. Last year, as we See here, it was just running a generic red livery, so we can't really complain. Yet again, we give Group 4, vintage/historic open wheel and modern era formula cars, a miss, which is fine with me because it falls outside the general remit of the channel, and I don't know why, but seeing open wheelers go around Daytona seems slightly perverse. But we do have some entries in Group 5A, which is, open quotes, big bore historic sports cars, etc. Again, exact words. This is, again, mostly a Porsche 911 class, but there are some other interesting entries, including the Bizzarini GT that showed up at Sebring last year, sometimes also known as an Isogrifo, entered by a chap who, and I do apologize to an extent for making this joke, although I made it last year as well, who has both the name and the picture of an arrested mob boss, Mr. Carlo Falcone, which is the sort of person one might expect to be driving an old Italian sports car. Mr. Falcone, if you'd like to talk about getting a slightly better headshot for your HSR login, drop a comment and I'd be happy to work something out, because you have a beautiful car. We need to get you a better picture. Not of the car, that's actually quite a good picture of the car. You have a bit over-sharpened. What else? We have zip ties and duct tape sponsored 917, I wish. Zip ties and duct tape 914-6, which is fun and a nice bright color to stand out under the evening lights. Love it. A 1964 Ford Falcon that definitely fits the big bore definition. There are two E46 M3s, nice, and a Boss 302 from a little bit later in the era from most of the rest of these entries, because, mostly 60s and 70s classes, two BMWs thrown in from the early 2000s, and then a 2012 Boss 302 Mustang from Gainesville. These last three form the SSA contingent of our sprint entries. Group 6, on the other hand, is where I think things start to get quite fun. It's our modern, or as HSR calls them, historic/post-historic prototypes, etc. And we do have a good bit of variety. There are, of course, a good number of LMP3s, with most of them also entered in the new this year HSR Prototype Challenge, for which this is the penultimate round at Daytona. The final rounds take place at Sebring in December. There are two Riley Mark 20 Daytona prototypes, which are, for the purposes of HSR's classification system, graded with the LMP2s. There's an Orica 03, which is fun, its rather close cousin, the FLM 09. Only one Corvette DP this year, a bit disappointingly, but at the interesting end of the field, we have a solo non-21st century entry, the 1985 Jag XJR7, looking forward to seeing that. We have a Lola B12/60 LMP1 from Mr. Alan Perbrick, whose appearance on the entry list actually delayed my video about the B12/80 to allow for an omnibus video instead. And rounding things out, we have, happily this year, I can report, well, actually just one of the Acura ARX 05 DPIs. The other one is here, but just in the classic 24 hours race. But we have Mr. Bob Nepal, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, with the ex-Meyershank racing car. Incidentally, MSR is coming back to IMSA next year to run Acura's LMDH, as Wayne Taylor is back in Cadillacs. And speaking of Cadillacs, we have three Cadillac DPI. No, we've got two. This is the problem when I script or make bullet points, different points. But anyway, we have two Cadillac DPIs as well. The Chip Ganassi Racing number 02 that was class of the field at Sebring Historics last year, and Mr. Jacek Mucha's car, which I suspect is one of the ex-Wayne Taylor Racing vehicles, as it previously ran as number 10, now running as number 07. But I am given to understand that, at least as of last year, his car has been further modified to run a 6-liter LS V8 motor rather than the DPI's stock power plant. Although this has not been borne out by the car's performance, at least by my observation and manual timing efforts. We'll see if the high banks prove friendlier than the bumps, but Mr. Marshall's machine will be hard to beat. Having not seen the Lola in action nor an ARX-05 in Mr. Kneepole's hands, I cannot comment on their relative competitivity, although apparently the Lola did quite well at the Masters Historic event in Austin the weekend before last, coming second behind the ex-Wayne Taylor Racing ARX-05 that we got to see last year at Sebring and we'll be seeing again later this week, still in the hands of a Mr. Chris Wiltshire and supported by Era Motorsports. This Lola is presumably, actually shipped over from Surrey, that's nice, presumably running the Toyota power plant carried over from the end of its Rebellion racing days, but obviously the entry list doesn't offer any specific confirmation of such details ahead of time. I have my fingers kind of crossed that for some odd reason it might have the Judd V10 that Rebellion ran in one of their chassis when it was still in B09 spec, but that is admittedly unlikely. Again, bunch of LMP3s. There's one more that came in at the very end of the field, but I think we all know enough about LMP3s not to need to belabor that particular point. And as we move on to Group 7A, for historic sports racers, we have a variety of what I call the plinth racers. These Swifts and Carbiers, which are about as utilitarian as one gets with race cars, as well as a Sol Chevron B19 that is at least somewhat varied in its lines, and a Replicar Lola T70 Mark IIIB, no photo provided, from Race Car Replicas. I'm not sure if I've seen this one before, so I'll reserve further comment until we see what's what on track. Group 7A also features a Lola T298, entered by one Mr. Jim Farley. If that name sounds vaguely familiar, it's definitely because he's the cousin of the late comedian Chris Farley, and not because he's the CEO of a rather small motoring concern known as Ford. Yeah. He actually is Chris Farley's cousin as well, but yeah, now Mr. Farley is a little bit better known for helming, I believe, the second largest auto manufacturer in the United States. Anyway, Group 7B is all modern equipment for either SCCA-type competition or track day use, and this year the latter is all we have in a rather denuded two-entry category of a Radical SR8 and a Norma M20F. I'm not sure I've seen either of these vehicles either, so further color commentary would be unjustified. Moving into Group 8, we have our historic stock cars, which also have their own historic cup running at this point and should be right at home on the Daytona high banks and even on the infield portion. Despite their design being, of course, oval-focused, they usually comport themselves with more dignity than one might expect from such machinery, and they sound absolutely amazing when they go by. Though Daytona doesn't offer quite as ideal an Overwatch location as the Corvette Bridge at Sebring, it should be good fun nevertheless. Ironically, despite having lived an hour away from Daytona since I was about 9 years old, I have yet to ever actually go to either a NASCAR race there or the Rolex 24. And unfortunately, this year's going to be no different. I have a conference that I have to fly out to next January in Aspen that directly overlaps with the 2025 edition of the race. And I really don't feel like going to Sebring next year. So we'll see what happens. Interesting. This is all the way from San Marino, which is one of the microstates in Europe I have not been to. Incidentally, on Friday, this Friday, Sebring is switching to Ticketmaster for their admission sales. So your call to action this week, mid-video, like, comment, subscribe, etc., is to go comment on their Facebook post about it and remind them of what an absolutely shit idea it is to associate with one of the lesser Satans. Seriously, I don't know how Ticketmaster gets people on board, but it does nobody any good apart from Ticketmaster. Anyway, moving into Group 9, We are most populated of the sprint groups with 35 entries. We have mostly modern cars, in fact, mostly post-2010 machinery in the GT3 vein, which naturally means another, fair raft of 911s, mostly recently retired Carrera Cup cars. But we do get some fun diversity as well, starting at the top with a Dodge Challenger GT1 and a Camaro Trans Am car that, if it's the one from Sebring last year, is seriously quick and rather good looking. This Mustang is perhaps giving itself a bit of a pat on the back to call itself a GT1, but be that as it may, there is also an edition of the most inappropriately named Chevrolet ever released, a Monte Carlo, a C6 of unspecified provenance, but likely a Callaway, given the classification as GT1B. Two Joy of Joys C6R GT2 Vets, so I can finally get enough photos to do a proper video about them after my camera batteries ran out at Le Mans Classic next year. We have a Z06, looks like just a standard street car that's been modified. We have an Audi R8 LMS rather than the LMP. Someone who owned a couple of them helpfully commented on last year's Sebring video to confirm that they are indeed all V10 engines. Speaking of V10 engined cars, we've got a 2014 Lamborghini Gallardo all the way from Dubai. Nice. Something a bit out of place for the group. There is a 1968, where did he go? 1968 Chevrolet Corvette Stingray, which I'm not sure why it's in a group titled Post-Historic / Modern Global GT, etc. But we've got another stalwart of the field, this wonderful 2000 Nissan GTR. I think that makes it an R34. But that usually puts in a consistently good showing at these events. We've got another BMW M3. We've got a Ferrari 458 Challenge car. So technically not a GT3 in the same way that the Porsche Carrera Cup cars aren't technically GT3s, but they are essentially GT3s. We've got a couple more old, what look like Trans Am cars. And quite happily, a couple of old whale tail Porsche 930/935s, including one all the way from Bretagne in France. And they are particularly welcome because they will almost certainly provide the flame-throwing that such an event always needs. And then we also have some folks down here that are quote-unquote exempt from classification. This could be anything from cars that are still within homologation, which is indeed what all of these look to be. And that would generally be from, Francis Seldorf. A few of these folks are really just coming here probably to get extra track time before their competition season next year. The slightly odd one out is this 2024 IRC GT, and if I've Googled the correct thing, I think that's an Australian supercar, which is a bit out of place, but looking forward to seeing it either way. And then we have a raft of other more modern machinery. All stuff that, again, we will see at the Roar Before the 24 next year, most likely. And moving into Group 10, it's more modernity, and oh look, more Porsches. I've got both GT3s and GT4s falling into this group, so we do get Caymans as well as 911s, but they represent a fully 90% of the current entries in this class. Power to you, Misters Gilbert and O'Connell, for bucking the trend. Mr. Gilbert with his 06 Callaway Corvette, and Mr. O'Connell with an M4 GT4. Moving on to Group 11, it's more of the same. Jerome Jackalone gets our first shout-out by being the chap who bought up the Urban Grid Camaro and kept it on track. Cheers to Mr. Marlin for bringing out a quarter-century-old Ferrari 360. But I think I am happiest, actually I do like the look of this 360 Challenge car, but I think I'm happiest to see this from Mr. Mark McKay, a Panos GT from 1999. I'm happiest to see this because, of course, Don Panos is one of the men who helped make modern racing what it is in the U.S., and he deserves more appreciation for it. And then, yeah, Raft, we got, okay, these folks I think have showed up kind of late to the game, but got another E46 M3 and a 2020 M2 CSR. I'm not sure what that actually, well, it'll look like an M2, but, and then one other older Porsche 964 911 just to round out this field. And finally, we shift towards the Classic 24 entrants. We'll just cover any notable entries in the groups that weren't already mentioned, because while the actual groupings are slightly different, there is a substantive crossover between the two technically separate race events, and thus it would really be belaboring the point to actually go through every single entry over again. For Group A, Group A includes the following: FIA prototypes over and under 3 liters, World Sports Car Championship cars to 1966, GTs over and under 3 liters, touring cars under 2, and anything from the International GT Championship, also up to 1966. And right off the bat, we've got 2 Lola T70s and 1 successor car, the T165. This second T70 of Mr. Gerard Lopez appears to possibly be the Penske chassis that won in 1969. I may just be making a rather needless association based on the color of the car, but perhaps not. It is admittedly unlikely, but we'll see what we can find out while we're there. It is worth noting that while the Penske chassis that won the 24 Hours of Daytona in 1969 was found badly damaged and stripped for parts after being stolen shortly after the 12 Hours of Sebring that year, and thus didn't make it to Le Mans, Mr. Penske did pay to have it repaired, and thus it was then sold on after the fact. We also have another replica, this time a GT40. I guess the replica T70 is not going to be competing in both the sprint races and the Classic 24 Hours, and a trio of chevrons. Unfortunately, one of the better sorted chevrons, this yellow one, crashed out last year during the nighttime hours, and I suspect was a total write-off. They had a few pieces of the car at Sebring late last year, and it did not look like it did well. Mr. Gregory was the owner of the car, and he is now, this year, entered in this Chevron B16, which, while I would argue substantively prettier than most of the follow-on models, usually isn't considered to be quite as high a performance car. We've also got this 1969 Camaro, sponsored by Craigar. I know I've got pictures of this car somewhere, but I cannot find them for the life of me. But if memory serves, it usually comports itself with dignity. I'm not familiar with this Pantera, but if it's anything like the one we saw last year, we're guaranteed some more flamies. I'm not sure what's going on with the additional info on this Shelby, but they are great-looking cars, and Mr. Ruede has been pretty active on the HSR Facebook page, so we'll see if we can't say hello to him. I think I've actually got a picture of this car from last year. If you're seeing another one spliced in, that's why. And, oh look, a lot of 911s and 914s again. But we do have one of the previously mentioned old salty dog Lotus Elan coupes, which that's such a great design, isn't it? Absolutely lovely. Moving on to Group B, these are our FIA sports racers, as well as IMSA GTX, All-American GT, like the Decon Monza, that is not joining us for this race, but I actually got a very nice email from the chap that owns it, and he will be at Sebring, and I'm going to hopefully be bringing you an interview with him, dear viewers, so that's exciting. We've got IMSA GTO and GTU eligible for this class, which is where we would see the RX-7 that I made a video about a couple weeks ago. But Mazda Motorsports doesn't seem to be joining us for the later season events this year. It is a moderately small class. Again, only 15 entries, a lot of 911s, unsurprisingly, and a trio of 930/935s, including this rather excellent-looking Jägermeister-sponsored example from Dr. Mike Smith. There's Mr. Farley as well in his T298, but I think I'm most looking forward to seeing this Mirage M6 and this Frisbee GB2 in the interests of, a little bit more video fodder for the more interesting and unusual cars in the race, as well as this Ford Capri RS 2600 to continue the Ford Escort story that I made a video on last year about this time. And I do hope that it joins us at Sebring as well, because let's be honest, that's a far more suitable track for this kind of car. I have actually seen this T298 a few times previous, but I, up until this point, didn't realize that it was Mr. Farley driving. So we will see what happens there. And a Datsun 240Z. Don't think I've seen this one before based on this image, but those are always fun cars. Group C, on the other hand, contains more than just vehicles from the 80s prototype class from which it takes its name, although we do have two examples from more or less that side of things. The Jag XJR7 that's also contesting the sprint races. No photo provided, but I think it's from Alpharetta, Georgia. I think I bought some wheels from not Mr. Gui, but another chap who previously owned the car for my MG, as well as a late model 962 all the way from Hong Kong. And then quite at the other end of the spectrum, we've got a whole raft of Porsches, including a 924. Not a Carrera GT, however, just an S. Although by 1988, I think the 924 was well out of production, so who knows what's going on there. And if we actually look at the picture, it says 944 Cup on this point, so maybe there's a typo in the entry list. Either way, talk about class disparity. The closing speed between the 962 and that 924 is going to be, much greater than 962 minus 24 is 38 miles an hour, and should be quite entertaining to watch. I'll try and get a video of that if the opportunity presents itself. Anyway, moving on and getting rid of the cookies banner. Group D, we are starting off strong with no less than 3 Riley Mark 20s and a Riley Mark 9, so adding some more camera fodder there for a reworking of the Daytona prototype deep dive video to include more of my own photos tracking the development of the class, as well as some of the side quests that Daytona prototypes went on around the world that I neglected to mention as I was kind of rushing to get that video done. We also have a very early Lola LMP1, the B2K/10, entered by the chap who I believe used to own the Shaki DB1 and may still do. I'll have to ask him if I have an opportunity. However, we only have one of the plinth cars racing through the night, presumably modified to accept headlamps. There's a Mustang GT again, and oh look, more Porsches. But there is a single, lonely little Aston Martin V8 Vantage down here at the bottom, which will be my favorite for this group because the late 2000s V8 Vantages have to be probably my favorite car design of the era and one of my favorite car designs of all time. Especially in person, they have a wonderful presence that very few cars I've ever seen have matched. Moving on to Group E, we've got 2 of the failed Formula Racer, the Elan DP02, or at least we did before they seem to have disappeared off the entry list. That's strange. What's going on here? So they're down here in Group F. They've been moved. Hooray! Oh boy, isn't it fun when they change these things. Okay, we've got the aforementioned vets. No, we don't. Okay, this is a typo on my part, actually. In Group F, we've got the 2 Elan DP02s. We've got the aforementioned vets. One of the X-Turner Z4s. That's in Group E. Okay, things have been reworked. I apologize for going up and down and up and down. And a large number of GT4s and GT3s, even if, yet again, they're mostly Porsches. Anyone else notable in here? Because now I'm afraid, we've got the Rebel Rock Camaro again, but we already talked about them. 981 GT4 Club Sport, those will be Caymans. I do like this RS3 touring car that really just shows up and is always up for a scrap, even if it is slightly outclassed by most of the other things on the field. And then moving into Group F, because things have been reorganized. This is slightly frustrating. We're in the sprint races, that's why. No, we're not. This is slightly frustrating, but it's more GT3s and GT4s, including the other X-Turner car, the M6 GTD, and we have now no less than 3 Cadillac DPIs to mix it up with the ARX 05s and the Lola. Yes, it's both of the ARX 05s, including the number 10 Acura of Mr. Stuart Wiltshire and the aforementioned car of Mr. Bob Nepole. That kind of alluded to the Stuart Wiltshire one already, but hey, we'll work on it. Our third Cadillac is the X-Mustang sampling car, which was a late addition to the list alongside Mr. Lopez's T70, but both quite welcome ones, to be sure. And rounding out the class, we have Mr. Tobias Lütke, who, if it's the same person that I think it is the guy who founded and still owns owns a controlling share in Shopify, in a very recent Orica 07 sporting number 18. I'll have to look and see if I can figure out which car that might be. An Orica 03 and FLM 09, as mentioned previously, and another pretty substantive raft of LMP3s, as well as a few more 911s. Again, apologies for that last little bit of confusion, because they changed the entry lists since I started recording the first part of this video this morning, but that does bring us to the end of the published entries. However, there are a few others that could be lurking for the last minute or otherwise hidden, as implied by the devious little disclaimer at the bottom of the page. And I've already stopped the recording, so you'll have to scroll down yourselves if you want to go look. That states the organizer of this event controls this list, and it may not represent the actual number of people registered. Originally, this section was a good bit longer than it will be now, but I'm happy to report that pretty much everyone that I thought might be hidden or was otherwise expecting to put in an entry has done so, and as such, this section's really been whittled down to just 1 or 2 cars that I suspect may show up anyway, and a few others that I'm outside of hopeful for or disappointed not to see. The most significant among those that showed up on the entry list at one point but have since dropped is a late model Peugeot 908 that appeared on the entry list pretty early on and dropped off a few weeks ago, I think round about the time that Hurricane Milton came through. I'm not sure then if this was as a precautionary measure of sorts or out of a desire for privacy, but hopefully we will get to see the rarest of the great diesel spaceships in the next couple of days, but it is a better than even chance that, unfortunately, the Peugeot has stayed home in England land. That was really the last big question mark, as the Mustang sampling Cadillac and Wayne Taylor Racing Acura have both appeared on our list. I'm not at this point expecting, but would be delighted to see a couple of the cars that we have seen either in the past few years at Daytona or Sebring, including Mr. Adrian Newey's Ford GT40, Mr. Lars Erik Nielsen's Porsche 962, pictured here, as both of those are presumably back on the other side of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, we're not getting any entries from Revs Institute this year. I was really hoping for 1 or more of their 917s. This thus means that I have a Southwest Florida trip on the cards here in the nearest future, so I can finish the 917 video. And I am a bit surprised that Mr. Travis Engen isn't bringing his R8 LMP and Lotus 23, as he's pretty much one of the stalwart gentlemen of the HSR field. But thinking back, I'm not sure if I've ever seen his car on an entry list for Daytona before, and it may be that he only does tracks where the R8 originally competed. and I don't think that it ever made it to Daytona. Less surprisingly missing is the Peugeot 908 HDI that I believe last ran at Daytona in 2022, as I remember hearing that it had some engine issues and don't know what ever came of any opportunities for repair on that car. I will do my best to find out more either here or at Sebring. Less surprising also is the Ferrari 333 SP that we saw at last year's event, as it had really an unfortunately heavy crash. Mr. Derek Drinkwater's Cadillac Le Monstre recreation, as it's also gone home, but I feel like I remember seeing that he may be bringing it back to the US next year. I'll have to reach out to him on Facebook. And most disappointingly, and frankly a little bit of a wagged finger at the fact that there are no MX-5 Cup cars entered this year after a 4-strong entry last year that not only featured a few of the bright spots from the IMSA MX-5 Championship, including Aaron Johnson and Jarrett Thomas, but I'd think that Fliz Performance would be putting a couple of these out here every chance they get. They're just down the street, and it's pretty good marketing. Not that they really need the marketing, because the MX-5 Cup Championship does plenty of that, but you never know. Oh, I'm also a little bit disappointed that none of the GTLM C7R Corvettes that have made it into private hands and that we've seen at several events in the past haven't deigned to put in an appearance for the past couple of years. Don't get me wrong, I like the C6s just as well, but the more the merrier, and all the more merrier at the sharp end of the field. Okay, and for the final round of comments before we wrap up, some shameless plugs before we close. If you'd like to learn more about the cars mentioned in this video, and by reflex some of those attending this weekend, the following already have videos about them on this channel. Both the Lola T70 and T165, all the chevrons are covered in a relatively short omnibus video called A Squadron of Chevrons, the BMW CSL, the Porsche 924 Carrera GT. Technically, there are none of those competing, but we touch on its successor, the 944, of which there are many competing. The Riley Daytona prototypes are discussed extensively in the DP Deep Dive video, the BMW Z4 GTD, the Cadillac DPI VR, the Acura ARX 05, also DPI, the Corvette Daytona prototype in both its own video and in the DP Deep Dive video, the Oreca 07, the Oreca FLM09, the C6R GT1 Corvette, the Diazio D962, the Bizzarini GT, and I think that about covers everything. Also, on the Riley front, unfortunately, Mr. Bob Riley passed away a few days ago at the age of 93. As another one of the great men who helped shape American and international racing over the past few decades, it's worth taking a moment to remember his contributions, which included designs that would be driven to victory in nearly every endurance race worth mentioning, and a few open-wheelers besides. I'm sure there'll be some commemoration at this weekend's event, but for my part, he lived a wonderful life and will be missed. Still, in all, that puts us at a field of, at time of recording on Tuesday the 29th of evening of the 29th. I started in the morning, but we are now at 138 entries for the Classic 24-hour and 164 entries for the sprint races, which in all compares pretty much even to last year's. Last year, all told, came out to 138 entries for the Classic and 159 for the sprints. But, of course, that's going by the entry list after the fact, and we still technically have one day to go before everything has to be fully in and started, so there may be one or two last-minute entries that sneak in under the radar tomorrow. On a macro level, I'd say it's pretty much a wash from last year as far as any economic indicators that we might derive from changes in either the makeup of the entry list or the quantity of entries, the latter for really quite obvious reasons. But we'll keep a close eye on the Sebring entry lists as well, as that event is about a month post-election and may be a better indicator of changes in economic sentiment after the fact. If any very last-minute entries that are particularly interesting do crop up, I'll have edited in just after this. So now we're over to the future, if that has indeed happened. And if not, well, let me know which cars you're most interested in hearing more about in the comments, and I'll do my best to focus on those. If any of you, dear viewers, happen to be headed to Daytona either as a spectator or competitor, I hope to see you there. If you're competing, best of luck. If you're spectating, drop a comment, let's have a beer. That brings us to the end of another video, and I have but to say, as always, thank you for your time this evening, or whenever and wherever you are watching, and I wish you all good night and a good tomorrow.